Now, Mr. Blaine, as you've been nearly around the world, I'll take you round the world on the phonograph. I'll not charge you anything. I'll take you on the steamer, Canadian steamer to Liverpool, and from Liverpool to London. From London on the London and Brighton Railroad to Brighton. And from Brighton, we'll go on those little 2-cent steamers across the English Channel to Calais. And from Calais, we'll go on the Chemin du Fer du Nord. I can't give you the exact Parisian pronunciation of this railroad, but I guess you'll understand. We'll get into Paris and make for the Grand Hotel. Then in the morning, we'll go to our bankers and get a little money on our letters of credit. Then we'll go and stay around Paris for about 2 weeks, go to Berlin. After we've stayed about 2-3 days in Berlin and got the blues, we'll go to St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg, we'll go to Moscow. San Francisco to Ogden. Ogden to Laramie. Laramie to Cheyenne. Cheyenne to Omaha. Omaha to Chicago. Chicago to Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York. Now, Mr. Blaine, why don't you say a few words on another cylinder so my young man can bring it over to the laboratory. I want to put it through a process and get several hundred duplicate cylinders so other people can hear what you say. Goodbye. Edison.
Here's another paper print of a Berliner gramophone recording, this one in the Berliner papers at the Library of Congress. When I first played it back last year, I had no idea what I was going to hear. Something from 1889, but what? Here's how it starts, with a transcription of the German on the left and an English translation on the right, prepared by Stefan Puy, Norman Bruderhofer, and myself.
Also hier ist eine Platte, die Louis Rosenthal mit nach Frankfurt nehmen will. Will die selber Papiertechnik. Vielleicht braucht verschiedene Prozesse, um das zu tun.
The idea, as it turns out, was to print gramophone discs on paper, send them cheaply through the mail, and then convert them back into playable form. Here's another excerpt which needs no translation.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That's all my opinion. Northern road, like the smear and cold.
That last part was Reiter's Morgengesang, which I believe is the oldest known surviving recording of singing in German. As a whole, I also believe this is the oldest gramophone recording that has been played in public in living memory.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. When the blazing sun is gone, when he nothing shines upon, when you say your little light, twinkle, twinkle over night.
Atlantic City, July the 7th, 1908. Mr. J.F. Bowers, President, National Association of Talking Machine Jobbers. Your action is very greatly appreciated by me. Thanking you again for the great honor shown me, I remain yours very sincerely, Emil Berliner.
Hello, Bobby. I'm going to sing for you. Listen. Hide a letter from thy sire, baby mine, baby mine. I could read and never tire, baby mine, baby mine. He is sailing over the sea, he is coming back to me, he is coming back to thee, baby mine, baby mine. He is coming back to thee, baby mine. I'm going to sing you another one. Listen to this. Oh, see that water-million and smiling through the fence. I wish that water-million it was mine. Oh, the white folks, they am foolish, and they ain't got good sense, for to keep that watermelon on the vine.
This man is not exactly resurrecting people, he's recreating the sounds of people and things that were once imprinted onto old gramophone recordings. Indiana University professor Patrick Feaster can often be found scouring dusty library shelves far from the public eye. The discs themselves disappeared more than a century ago, but Feaster works with rare pictures of those discs.
I've been taking images of sound recordings printed on paper in ink and converting them back into sound, just as though they were playable discs or cylinders or other media that we slap onto turntables, play on phonographs, and so on.
Feaster's research has turned up what are believed to be the oldest recordings ever made by humans.
This recording, Der Handschuh, appears to be the oldest gramophone recording we can listen to today.
Just how old? This recording was made in Germany in 1890 by a 90-year-old army general, a man who was born in the late 18th century.
Zoom in here so you can actually see up close what this looks like. Scanned.
Okay, zoom in again. Thank you.
Isolate the particular line that we're interested in. So now we fill in the bottom, and then separately we fill in the top with white.
Also am Schlesien am 21. Oktober 1889.
So in that sense, it's the earliest ancestor of all the vintage vinyl that anybody has ever tried to play. It's the basis for a lot of cinema, anything pre-recorded for television, radio, and so forth. It's the whole idea of the pre-recorded action, the pre-recorded performance, started with the phonograph. So if we want to understand how people first worked out how to deal with that possibility and actually made it meaningful, the phonograph is where we have to find it out.
Reporting from Indiana University, I'm Mike Pfeiffer.
The Smithsonian has a very large collection, relatively speaking, of some of the earliest sound recordings anywhere in the world. We have examples from the Volta Laboratory here in Washington, D.C. The Volta Laboratory was the sound laboratory for Alexander Graham Bell, his cousin Chichester Bell, and a mechanician, an instrument maker named Charles Sumner Tainter. From this Volta Laboratory come all kinds of sound recording experiments, and that is the bulk of our collection. We have lots of documentation to record what they did when. In these early sound recordings, we have about 200 sound recordings from 1881 to 1885 from this Volta Laboratory, and it's these that Carl and Peter have been extracting sound from.
We are here in the Imaging Laboratory in the Preservation Directorate at the Library of Congress. We have here a laboratory, a set of instruments that were developed initially to image the more common sound recording materials so that we could play them non-invasively and with computer automated tools that allowed very efficient transfer of the information. We have one device over here, and this is a turntable which will rotate under the control of a computer, and this is a type of camera. It's a three-dimensional camera, so it takes pictures not only of left and right of the scene, but also of the distance, the depth. Okay, so it can create, if you like, a topographic picture. And this kind of looks like a photograph to people, but it's actually not a photograph, it's a depth image. So the black are actually the grooves. When you listen to one of these things for the first time, it's often confusing or almost inaudible what is being said. And my experience is that once you know what's being said, it's actually pretty easy to conclude that that's indeed what's being said.
Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of American History announced this week they've identified the voice of Alexander Graham Bell for the first time on one of the oldest audio recordings to date.
You are my heart. Alexander Graham Bell.
It may be tough to hear Bell's voice there, but the recording was made on a wax and cardboard disc 128 years ago. Researchers found it with a note with the initials AGB and the date April 15, 1885. Bell invented the telephone in 1876, 9 years before the recording was created. So why was he experimenting with what were essentially CDs made of wax? And how can we even play a cardboard and wax disc? Researchers at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory used a jointly developed technique from 2002 which scans the disc and creates a high-resolution digital map of it. That digital map is then processed to try and remove any scratches or skips before it's exposed to a software that simulates the movement of a stylus along with the grooves of the disc, like a virtual record player. While the museum also identified the voice of Bell's father from an 1881 recording, it still has more than 200 recordings in its collection that have not yet been analyzed. For Newsy, I'm Candace Avilés.
This record has been made by Alexander Graham Bell in the presence of Dr. Christopher A. Bell on the 16th of April, 1885 at the Balta Laboratory. 121 Pacific Avenue, Washington, D.C. In witness Florida, you are my heart. Alexander Graham Bell.
When Americans went to bed on March 26, 2008, we were in general accord that Thomas Edison had invented sound recording. But when we woke up the next day, we heard this voice gently singing to us in French, firmly telling us we were mistaken. This rendition of the French folk song Au clair de la lune, resurrected from a vault in Paris only days before, is ghostly, haunting, enchanting, and, we later learned, played back at the wrong speed. Yet until that day, the very existence of such a recording had literally been the stuff of science fiction. It was as if we had discovered time travel, or at least a machine that could send your voice into the future. Airborne sounds had been traced onto paper since the 1850s by a machine called the phonograph. Throughout the 1860s and 70s, any well-appointed cabinet of acoustical instruments required a phonograph to capture and study the qualities of airborne sounds. We knew that Leon Scott, as he signed his name, had applied for a patent on his invention in 1857, and that he updated his application in 1859. His 1859 machine recorded on a revolving cylinder, and in this form Scott's phonograph eerily anticipated phonographs of the future. Our results were indeed newsworthy. We had recovered what we believed to be humanity's first playable recording of its own voice. We'd prepared a press release with all the basic information, but let me tell you, when your story breaks on the front page of the New York Times, you don't need no stinking press release. Within hours, this was an international story.
The American Thomas Edison is widely regarded as the father of recorded sound, but there are claims now that Mr. Edison was beaten to it by 17 years by a Frenchman. Audio historians have dug up a recording made in 1860 on what's known as a phonautograph, a device created by Parisian inventor Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville, and for the first time found a way of playing the sound out loud. On the short clip, a woman can be heard singing Au clair de la lune. And I spoke earlier to the inventor's great-grandson, Laurent Scott de Martinville, and played that recording to him the first time he had heard it.
I'm so happy for him because in his last will he asked his children and grandchildren to make sure that his discovery would not be ignored. As a matter of fact, when he passed away, he had just been, as a spectator, assisting to the presentation of Mr. Edison's invention in Paris. And his name was not even mentioned, and he was so upset that I believe that this is one of the reasons that eventually ended tragically.
One of the very first phonograms on which Patrick used his new technique was this one, number 8. Made in 1860 and deposited by Scott with the French Academy of Sciences in the same dossier as Au clair. Number 8 contains the opening lines from Aminta, Torquato Tasso's classic play from 1573. Here Scott wrote the opening words in the margin. Given the loops and lifts and crazy waveforms traced on this page, I thought we'd never hear what was recorded on it. But the playback from Patrick's technique is amazingly interpretable. As if hearing a recording made in 1860 isn't cool enough, this is the voice of the inventor himself. Here's how we know this is the voice of the inventor. Scott wrote in the margins, I was wrong. It should have been umane forme, not forme umane. Before we heard this, we didn't know if Scott was referring to the words written on the page, which are in fact transposed, or to the words spoken in the recording. Now that we can hear the recording, we know that he transposed both. So by admitting it was his mistake, by saying, I was wrong, Scott identifies himself as the speaker. How cool is that? As we prepared Au clair for its world premiere in 2008, we settled on 500 hertz as the voice that sounded most right to us. And in doing so, we introduced the now iconic voice of a haunting apparition to the world. And sure enough, when we slow Au clair to the same calibration speed as Aminta, Scott's self-identified voice appears from the smoke. This is Scott speaking slowly, clearly, lugubriously, as he watches the stylus vibrate to the sounds of his own voice. I'd like to play for you one more of Scott's 1860 recordings from his Academy of Sciences deposit. In this, he sings a lively rendition of Fly Little Bee from a comic opera by Victor Massé, written just 4 years before. To our knowledge, this is Scott's last phonogram from the fall of 1860. It's certainly one of his most melodic, joyful, and playful recordings. Perhaps he just got tired of conducting experiments. Distorted as the vibrations may be, they open a window onto the following experiment that Lissajous himself may have attended in 1857, an experiment to determine the phonograph's ability to record the timbre of a musical instrument. This is the earliest airborne sound reproduced to date. Let me be clear. Eau Claire remains humanity's first playable dated recording of its own voice, but this scale, played by an unidentified cornetist, holds the record for the earliest airborne sound recording reproduced to date. 1857, 3 years before Eau Claire de la Lune. 1857, 20 years before Thomas Edison invented the phonograph. 1857, 31 years earlier than any recording any living person had heard before first sounds made the silent decade speak. Unfortunately, Édouard-Léon Scott de Martinville died in 1879 without receiving his due recognition. Left without funds or pension, his family was forced to yield his remains to an unmarked grave. Laurent Scott de Martinville has searched all of Paris, but has yet to find his great-grandfather's final place of rest. What an irony. The first man to send his voice into the future, lost forever in Paris, resurrected for all time in America.